Apple is worth $4.6 trillion. It's one of the most secretive companies on the planet, famous for locking its unreleased products behind years of silence before the world ever sees them. But on July 10th, 2026, Apple did something it almost never does. It walked into a federal courtroom in Northern California and accused one of the biggest AI companies on Earth of stealing its secrets from the inside. That company was OpenAI. This is the story of the lawsuit now rocking Silicon Valley, and why Apple says the betrayal came from people it trained, promoted, and trusted for decades. Let's rewind first. In 2024, Apple and OpenAI weren't enemies. They were partners. ChatGPT was integrated directly into the iPhone through Apple Intelligence, one of the biggest software partnerships in tech at the time. Apple, a company that rarely lets outside technology anywhere near its operating system, had opened the door to OpenAI. So what changed? To understand that, you have to go back even further, to a company called I.O. In 2023, legendary Apple designer Johnny Ive, the man behind the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad, left his design studio Lovefrom to start something new. Alongside him were a small group of former Apple veterans, including a man named Tang Tan. Tan wasn't a random hire. He had spent 24 years at Apple, rising to vice president of product design, working directly on the iPhone and the Apple Watch, two of the most closely guarded product lines the company has ever built. In May of 2025, OpenAI acquired I.O. in an all-stock deal, valuing the startup at roughly $6.5 billion. OpenAI's largest acquisition ever. Johnny Ive would lead design across OpenAI. Tang Tan would become OpenAI's chief hardware officer, and the goal was ambitious: build an entirely new category of AI-powered devices. This is where Apple's lawsuit picks up the story. Apple alleges that after Tan joined OpenAI, he used his knowledge of Apple's internal projects in ways that crossed a legal line. According to the complaint, Tan allegedly used Apple's own confidential project codenames while recruiting current Apple employees to join OpenAI. Apple also alleges that Tan asked job candidates who still worked at Apple to bring in actual parts, things like batteries, logic boards, and internal components, for what the lawsuit describes as show and tell during interviews. Apple goes further, alleging that Tan circulated an internal Apple document, one originally meant to explain the company's exit security checks for departing employees, in order to help new OpenAI hires avoid detection when they left Apple. Tan isn't the only person named in the complaint. Apple also alleges that a former senior electrical engineer named Chang Liu, who spent 8 years at Apple, kept a company-issued laptop after leaving to join OpenAI. According to the lawsuit, Liu used that laptop to access and download dozens of confidential files from Apple's internal network, some of which were reportedly related to unreleased Apple technology, engineering presentations, and proprietary project data. Apple's complaint states, quote, "At every level, from members of its technical staff to its chief hardware officer, and in coordination with business partners, OpenAI has been stealing Apple's trade secrets and confidential information." It's important to say this clearly. These are allegations made by Apple in a legal filing. None of this has been proven in court, and OpenAI disputes it. In response, OpenAI released a statement saying, quote, "We have no interest in other companies' trade secrets. We remain focused on building innovative technology that empowers people everywhere." So why does this lawsuit matter beyond the individuals named in it? Because OpenAI, through its acquisition of I.O., is reportedly preparing to launch its first hardware device, one shaped in large part by the very team that Apple says carried its secrets out the door. Apple's argument is that OpenAI's entire hardware business is now sitting on a foundation built with Apple's own knowledge. In the words of the complaint itself, Apple describes OpenAI's hardware business as, quote, rotten to its core. Apple isn't just asking for money. According to the filing, Apple wants the court to stop OpenAI from using any of its alleged trade secrets, to force the return of any confidential material still in OpenAI's possession, to preserve evidence relevant to the case, and to award financial damages for the alleged theft. This lawsuit also lands at a strange, almost symbolic moment for both companies. Apple's CEO, Tim Cook, is preparing to hand over leadership to John Ternus later this year, closing out one era of Apple's history, right as this legal battle opens a new one. Meanwhile, OpenAI is reportedly preparing for its own initial public offering, all while facing intensifying competition from companies like Anthropic and Google. And this isn't OpenAI's first time in a courtroom. In 2023, the New York Times sued OpenAI and Microsoft, alleging their content was used without permission to train AI models. And just months before Apple filed this case, OpenAI itself won a very different legal fight against Elon Musk, one of its own co-founders. A federal jury ruled that Musk had waited too long to sue the company over claims that Sam Altman and OpenAI had abandoned its original nonprofit mission. In other words, OpenAI has spent the last few years simultaneously defending itself in court and being accused, one lawsuit after another, of taking things it shouldn't have. So, where does this leave Apple and OpenAI? Right now, this case is just getting started. It was filed in a federal court, it's still in its early stages, and it will likely take months, possibly much longer, before any final ruling comes down. OpenAI has denied any wrongdoing, and nothing alleged in the complaint has been proven. But the story itself says something important about this exact moment in tech. The world's most secretive hardware company just accused the world's most talked about AI company of turning its own former talent into a pipeline for stolen secrets. All while the two companies were still supposed to be partners on the very phone in your pocket. Whatever the court eventually decides, this case is now part of the historical record of how the AI hardware race is actually being fought. Not just in research labs and product launches, but in depositions, discovery requests, and federal courtrooms. If you want to understand how OpenAI got here in the first place, from a research lab to Johnny Ive's $6.5 billion hardware bet, to a company now facing Apple in federal court, that's a story we're covering next. Subscribe so you don't miss it.